Chapter 8 of the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marcus Wachenheim. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 8. The sun was up so high when I walked that I judged it was after 8 o'clock. I laid there in the grass and the cool shade, thinking about things and feeling rested and rather comfortable and satisfied. I could see the sun out at one or two holes, but mostly it was big trees all about and gloomy in there amongst them. There was freckled places on the ground where the light sifted down through the leaves, and the freckled places swapped about a little, showing there was a little breeze up there. A couple of squirrels sat on a limb and jabbered at me very friendly. I was powerful lazy and comfortable, didn't want to get up and cook breakfast. Well, I was dozing off again when I thinks I hears a deep sound of boom away up the river. I rouses up and rests on my elbow and listens. Pretty soon I hears it again. I hopped up and went and looked out at a hole in the leaves, and I see a bunch of smoke layin' on the water a long ways up, about abreast the ferry. And there was the ferry boat full of people floatin' along down. I knowed what was the matter now. Boom! I see the white smoke squirt out of the ferry boat's side. You see, they was firing cannon over the water, trying to make my carcass come to the top. I was pretty hungry, but I won't going to do for me to start a fire, because they might see the smoke. So I sat there and watched the cannon smoke and listened to the boom. The river was a mile wide there, and it always looked pretty on a summer morning, so I was having a good enough time seeing them hunt for my remainders, if I only had a bite to eat. Well, then I happened to think how they always put quicksilver in loaves of bread and float them off, because they always go right to the drownded carcass and stop there. So, says I, I'll keep a lookout, and if any of them's floatin' around after me, I'll give them a show. I changed to the Illinois edge of the island to see what luck I could have, and I warn't disappointed. A big double loaf come along, and I most got it with a long stick, but my foot slipped and she floated out further. Of course I was where the current set in the closest to the shore. I knowed enough for that. But by and by along comes another one, and this time I won. I took out the plug and shook out the little dab of quicksilver, and set my teeth in. It was baker's bread, what the quality eat, none of your low-down corn-pone. I got a good place amongst the leaves, and set there on a log, munchin' the bread and watchin' the ferry boat, and very well satisfied. And then something struck me. I says, now I reckon the widow or the parson or somebody prayed that this bread would find me, and here it has gone and done it. So there ain't no doubt but there is something in that thing. That is, there's something in it when a body like the widow or the parson prays, but it don't work for me, and I reckon it don't work for only just the right kind. I lit a pipe and had a good long smoke, and went on watchin'. The ferry boat was floatin' with the current, and I allowed I'd have a chance to see who was aboard when she come along, because she would come in close, where the bread did. When she'd got pretty well along down towards me, I put out my pipe and went to where I fished out the bread and lay down behind a log on the bank in a little open place. Where the log forked I could peep through. By and by she come along, and she drifted in so close that they could a run out a plank and walked ashore. Most everybody was on that boat. Pop and Judge Thatcher and Bessie Thatcher and Joe Harper and Tom Sawyer and his old Aunt Polly and Sid and Mary and plenty more. Everybody was talking about the murder. But the captain broke in and says, "Look sharp now, the current sets in the closest here, and maybe he's washed ashore and got tangled amongst the brush at the water's edge. I hope so, anyway." Why, I didn't hope so. They all crowded up and leaned over the rails nearly in my face and kept still, watching with all their might. I could see them first rate, but they couldn't see me. Then the captain sung out, "Stand away!" and the cannon let off such a blast right before me that it made me deaf with the noise and pretty near blind with the smoke, and I judged I was gone. If they'd had some bullets in, I reckon they'd a got the corpse they was after. Well, I see I warn't hurt, thanks to goodness. The boat floated on and went out of sight around the shoulder of the island. I could hear the booming now and then, further and further off, and by, after an hour, I didn't hear it no more. The island was 3 mile long. I judged they had got to the foot, and was giving it up. But they didn't yet a while. They turned around the foot of the island and started up the channel on the Missouri side, under steam and booming once in a while as they went. I crossed over to that side and watched them. When they got abreast the head of the island, they quit shooting and dropped over to the Missouri shore and went home to the town. I knowed I was all right now. Nobody else would come a-hunting after me. I got my traps out of the canoe and made me a nice camp in the thick woods. I made a kind of a tent out of my blankets to put my things under so the rain couldn't get at them. I catched a catfish and haggled him open with my saw, and toward sundown I started my campfire and had supper. Then I set out a line to catch some fish for breakfast. When it was dark, I sat by my campfire smoking and feeling pretty well satisfied. But by and by it got sort of lonesome, and so I went and sat on the bank and listened to the currents washing along, and counted the stars and drift logs and rafts that come down, and then went to bed. There ain't no better way to put in time when you are lonesome. You can't say so. You soon get over it. And so for 3 days and nights, no difference, just the same thing. But the next day I went exploring around down through the island. I was boss of it. It all belonged to me, so to say, and I wanted to know all about it, but mainly I wanted to put in the time. I found plenty strawberries, ripe and prime, and green summer grapes, and green raspberries, and the green blackberries was just beginning to show. They would all come handy by and by, I judged. Well, I went fooling along in the deep woods till I judged I warn't far from the foot of the island. I had my gun along, but I hadn't shot nothing. It was for protection. Thought I would kill some game nigh home. About this time I mighty near stepped on a good-sized snake, and it went sliding off through the grass and flowers, and I after it, trying to get a shot at it. I clipped along, and all of a sudden I bounded right onto the ashes of a campfire that was still smoking. My heart jumped up amongst my lungs. I never waited for to look further, but uncocked my gun and went sneaking back on my tiptoes as fast as I ever could. Every now and then I stopped a second amongst the thick leaves and listened, but my breath come so hard I couldn't hear nothing else. I slung along another piece further, then listened again, and so on, and so on. If I see a stump, I took it for a man. If I trod on a stick and broke it, it made me feel like a person had cut one of my breaths in two, and I only got half, and the short half too. When I got to the camp, I warn't feeling very brash. There warn't much sand in my craw, but I says, this ain't no time to be fooling around. So I got all my traps into my canoe again, so as to have them out of sight, and I put out the fire and scattered the ashes around to look like an old last year's camp, and then clumb a tree. I reckon I was up in the tree 2 hours, but I didn't see nothing. I didn't hear nothing. I only thought I heard and seen as much as 1,000 things. Well, I couldn't stay up there forever, so at last I got down, but I kept in the thick woods and on the lookout all the time. All I could get to eat was berries and what was left over from breakfast. By the time it was night I was pretty hungry, so when it was good and dark I slid out from shore before moonrise and paddled over to the Illinois bank, about 1/4 of a mile. I went out in the woods and cooked a supper, and I had about made up my mind I would stay there all night when I hear a plunkety-plunk, plunkety-plunk, and says to myself, horses coming, and next I hear people's voices. I got everything into the canoe as quick as I could and went creeping through the woods to see what I could find out. I hadn't got far when I hear a man say, "We better camp here if we can find a good place. The horses is about beat out. Let's look around." I didn't wait, but shoved out and paddled away easy. I tied up in the old place and reckoned I would sleep in the canoe. I didn't sleep much. I couldn't somehow, for thinking, and every time I waked up I thought somebody had me by the neck. So the sleep didn't do me no good. By and by I says to myself, I can't live this way. I'm a-going to find out who it is that's here on the island with me. I'll find it out or bust. Well, I felt better right off. So I took my paddle and slid out from shore, just a step or two, and then let the canoe drop along down amongst the shadows. The moon was shining, and outside of the shadows it made it most as light as day. I poked along well on to an hour, everything still as rocks and sound asleep. Well, by this time I was most down to the foot of the island. A little ripply, cool breeze began to blow, and that was as good as saying the night was about done. I give her a turn with the paddle and brung her nose to shore. Then I got my gun and slipped out and into the edge of the woods. I sat down there on a log and looked out through the leaves. I see the moon go off watch, and the darkness begin to blanket the river. But in a little while I see a pale streak over the tree-tops, and knowed the day was comin'. So I took my gun and slipped off towards where I had run across that campfire, stopping every minute or two to listen. But I hadn't no luck somehow. I couldn't seem to find the place. But by and by, sure enough, I catched a glimpse of a fire away through the trees. I went for it, cautious and slow. By and by I was close enough to have a look, and there laid a man on the ground. It most give me the fantas. He had a blanket around his head, and his head was nearly in the fire. I sat there behind a clump of bushes in about 6 foot of him, and kept my eyes on him steady. It was getting gray daylight now. Pretty soon he gapped and stretched himself and hove off the blanket, and it was Miss Watson's Jim. I bet I was glad to see him. I says, "Hello, Jim," and skipped out. He bounced up and stared at me wild. Then he drops down on his knees and puts his hand together and says, "Don't hurt me, don't. I ain't ever done no harm to a ghost. I always liked dead people and done all I could for 'em. You go and get in the river again, where you belongs, and don't do nothing to old Jim, that is always your friend." Well, I warn't long making him understand I warn't dead. I was ever so glad to see Jim. I warn't lonesome now. I told him I warn't afraid of him telling the people where I was. I talked along, but he only set there and looked at me, never said nothing. Then I says, "It's good daylight. Let's get breakfast. Make up your campfire good." "What's the use of making a campfire to cook strawberries and such tuck? But you got a gun, ain't you? Then we can get something better than strawberries." "Strawberries and such truck," I says. "Is that what you live on?" "I couldn't get nothing else," he says. "Why, how long you been on the island, Jim?" "I come here the night after you was killed." "What, all that time?" "Yes, indeedy." "And ain't you had nothing but that kind of rubbish to eat?" "No, sir, nothing else." "Well, you must be most starved, ain't you?" "I reckon I could eat a horse. I think I could. How long you been on the island?" "Since the night I got killed." "No. Why, what has you lived on? But you got a gun. Oh, yes, you got a gun. That's good. Now you kill something and I'll make up the fire." So we went out over to where the canoe was, and while he built a fire in a grassy open place amongst the trees, I fetched meal and bacon and coffee pot and frying pan, and sugar and tin cups, and the nigger was set back considerable, because he reckoned it was all done with witchcraft. I catched a good big catfish too, and Jim cleaned him with his knife, and fried him. When breakfast was ready, we lolled on the grass and eat it smoking hot. Jim laid it in with all his might, for he was most about starved. Then, when we had got pretty well stuffed, we laid off and lazied. By and by Jim says, "But looky here, Huck, who was it that was killed in that shanty, if it weren't you?" Then I told him the whole thing, and he said it was smart. He said Tom Sawyer couldn't get up no better plan than what I had. Then I says, "How do you come to be here, Jim, and how'd you get here?" He looked pretty uneasy, and didn't say nothing for a minute. Then he says, "Maybe I better not tell." "Why, Jim?" "Well, there's reasons, but you wouldn't tell on me if I was to tell you, would you, Huck?" "Blamed if I would, Jim." "Well, I believe you, Huck. I run off." "Jim!" "But mind, you said you wouldn't tell. You know, you said you wouldn't tell, Huck." "Well, I did. I said I wouldn't, and I'll stick to it. Honest Injun, I will. People would call me a low-down abolitionist and despise me for keeping mum, but that don't make no difference. I ain't going to tell, and I ain't going back there anyways. So now let's know all about it." "Well, you see, it is this way. Old Mrs., that Mrs. Watson, she pecks on me all the time and treats me pretty rough, but she always said she wouldn't sell me down to Orleans. But I noticed there was a nigger trade around the place considerable lately, and I began to get uneasy. Well, one night I creeps to the door pretty late, and the door won't quite shut, and I hear old Missus tell the widow she gonna sell me down to Orleans, but she didn't wanna, but she could get $800 for me, and it is such a big stack of money she couldn't resist. The widow, she tried to get her to say she wouldn't do it, but I never waited to hear the rest. I lit out mighty quick, I tell you. I took out and shinned down the hill and spec to steal a skiff along the shore, somewhere above the town, but they was people stirring yet, so I hid in the old tumble-down copper shop on the bank to wait for everybody to go away. Well, I was there all night. They was somebody round all the time. Long 'bout 6 in the morning, skiffs began to go by, and 'bout 8 or 9, every skiff that went along was talking 'bout how your pop come over to town and say you's killed. These last skiffs was full of ladies and gentlemen a going over to see the place. Sometimes they'd pull up to the shore and take a rest before they'd started across, so they'd talk. I got to know all about the killing. I was powerful sorry you was killed, Huck, but I ain't no more now. I laid there under the shavings all day. I was hungry, but I warn't afraid, because I knowed old Missus and the widow was going to start to a camp meeting right after breakfast, and be gone all day, and they knows I goes off with the cattle 'bout daylight, so they wouldn't expect to see me round the place, and so they wouldn't miss me till after dark in the evening. The other servants wouldn't miss me, 'cause they'd shin out and take holiday soon as the old folks was out of the way. Well, when it come dark, I took out up the river road and went 'bout 2 mile or more to where they weren't no houses. I'd make up my mind 'bout what I was a-goin' to do. You see, if I kep' on trying to get away afoot, the dogs 'd track me. If I stole a skiff to cross over, they'd miss that skiff, you see, and they'd know 'bout where I'd land on the other side, and where to pick up my track. So I says a raft is what I's after. It don't make no track. I see a light comin' round the point by and by, so I wade in and shove a log ahead of me, and swum more'n halfway 'cross the river, and got in 'mongst the driftwood, and kept my head down low, and kinder swum again the current till the raft come along. Then I swum to the stern of it and took a holt. It clouded up and was pretty dark for a while, so I clumb up and lay down on the planks. The man is all way yonder in the middle where the lantern was. The river was risin', and they was a good current, so I reckoned that by 4 in the morning I'd be 25 mile down the river, and then I'd slip in just before daylight and swim ashore, and take to the woods in the Illinois side. But I didn't have no luck. When we was most down to the head of the island, a man begun to come aft with the lantern. I see it warn't no use for to wait, so I slid overboard and struck out for the island. Well, I had a notion I could land most anywheres, but I couldn't. Bank too bluff. I was most to the foot of the island before I found a good place. I went into the woods and judged I wouldn't fool with rafts no more, long as they moved the lantern round so. I had my pipe and a plug of dog leg and some matches in my cap, and they weren't wet, so I was all right. And so you ain't had no meat nor bread to eat all this time? Why didn't you get mud turtles? How you going to get 'em? You can't slip up on 'em and grab 'em, and how's a body going to hit 'em with a rock? How could a body do it in the night? And I won't going to show myself on the bank in the daytime. Well, that's so. You had to keep in the woods all time, of course. Did you hear 'em shooting the cannon? Oh, yes, I knowed they was after you. I see 'em go by, watched 'em through the bushes. Some young birds come along, flying a yard or two at a time and lighting. Jim said it was a sign it was going to rain. He said it was a sign when young chickens flew that way, and so he reckoned it was the same way when young birds done it. I was going to catch some of 'em, but Jim wouldn't let me. He said it was death. He said his father laid mighty sick once, and some of them catched a bird, and his old granny said his father would die, and he did. And Jim said you mustn't count the things you're going to cook for dinner, because that would bring bad luck. The same if you shook the tablecloth after sundown. And he said if a man owned a beehive, and that man died, the bees must be told about it before sun-up next morning, or else the bees would all weaken down and quit work and die. Jim said bees wouldn't sting idiots, but I didn't believe that, because I had tried them lots of times myself, and they wouldn't sting me. I had heard about some of these things before, but not all of 'em. Jim knowed all kinds of signs. He said he knowed most everything. I said it looked to me like all the signs was about bad luck, and so I asked him if there warn't any good luck signs. He says, "Mighty few, and they ain't no use to a body. What you want to know when good luck's a-comin' for? Want to keep it off?" And he said, "If you's got hairy arms and a hairy breast, it's a sign that you's goin' to be rich. Well, they's some use in a sign like that, 'cause it's so far ahead. You see, maybe you's got to be poor a long time first, and so you might get discouraged and kill yourself if you didn't know by the sign that you goin' to be rich by and by." Have you got hairy arms and a hairy breast, Jim? What's the use to ask that question? Don't you see I has? Well, are you rich? No, but I been rich once, and gonna be rich again. Once I'd have $14, but I took to speculating and got busted out. What did you speculate in, Jim? Well, first I tackled stock. What kind of stock? Why, livestock. Cattle, you know. I put $10 in a cow, but I ain't going to risk no more money in stock. The cow up and died on my hands." "So you lost the $10? "No, I didn't lose it at all. I only lost 'bout 9 of it. I sold the hide and taller for $1.10. "You had $5.10 left. Did you speculate any more?" "Yes. You know, that one-legged nigger that belongs to old Miss Bradish, well, he sot up a bank, and say anybody that put in $1 would get $4 more at the end of the year. Well, all the niggers went in, but they didn't have much. I was the only one that had much. So I stuck out for more than $4, and I said if I didn't get it, I'd start a bank myself. Well, of course that nigger wanted to keep me out of the business, because he says they weren't business enough for 2 banks. So he said I could put in my $5, and he'd pay me 35 at the end of the year. So I done it. Then I reckoned I'd invest the $35 right off and keep things a-movin'. There was a nigger named Bob that had ketched a wood flat, and his master didn't know it, and I bought it off'n him and told him to take the $35 when the end of the year come. But somebody stole the wood flat that night, and next day the one-legged nigger say the bank's busted. So they didn't none of us get no money." "What did you do with the 10 cents, Jim?" "Well, I was going to spend it, but I had a dream, and the dream told me to give it to a nigger named Balloom. Balloom's as they call him for short. He's one of them chuckleheads, you know. But he's lucky, they say, and I see I weren't lucky. The dream say let Balloom invest the 10 cents, and he'd make a rise for me. Well, Balloom he took the money, and when he was in church he heard a preacher say that whoever give to the poor lend to the Lord, and bound to get his money back 100 times. So Balloom he took and give the 10 cents to the poor, and laid low to see what was going to come of it." "Well, what did come of it, Jim?" "Nothing ever come of it. I couldn't manage to collect that money no way, and Balloom he couldn't. I ain't going to lend no more money, doubt I see the security. Bound to get your money back 100 times, the preacher says. If I could get the 10 cents back, I'd call it squash, and be glad of the chance." "Well, it was all right anyway, Jim, long as you're going to be rich again some time or other." "Yes, and I's rich now, come to look of it. I owns myself, and I's worth $800. I wished I'd had the money. I wouldn't want no more." End of chapter 8.